There are three topics I'm going to talk about today. As many people, I think, around the region appreciate, many of us are interested in how are the crabs and the oysters and the fish. So I'm going to talk about blue crabs, oysters, and fish passage as an indicator of available habitat for fisheries. Overall, if we look at the Chesapeake Bay as a statistical matter, the Bay the Bay program is currently at 48% of its goal for fish and shellfish, and that's about a 4% decrease in progress towards the overall goal. Next up, I'm going to talk a little bit about blue crabs and abundance. 2008 saw a drop of about 36 million in the population of spawning age blue crabs, which lowered progress towards this species goal by about 18%. We have information that suggests this drop in population was driven by a lack of both sufficient water quality and habitat, especially as Rich described these underwater grasses that provide shelter and food for the crab population. Our target is to have 200 million blue crabs that are at least 1 year old in the Bay, and this abundance we think can sustain a harvest of about 60 to 65 million pounds each year while still preserving 20% of the spawning population that are critical to enable future generations of crabs in a sustainable fishery. Last year, the population of spawning age crabs in the Bay was about 120 million, or 60% towards that goal of 200, and that's a decrease from 156 million in 2007. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about blue crab management and what's going on to try to improve the situation for crabs. In 2008, both Maryland and Virginia established a goal to reduce the harvest of mature female crabs by 34%. Of course, that recognizes that without female crabs, we don't have an ability for future generations. We really need to protect that portion of the population. In Maryland, new regulations included an early seasonal closure, that is, watermen had to stop fishing earlier than usual last year, increased size limits for peeler crabs and commercial catch limits, and the recreational fishery is now prohibited from harvesting any female crabs. So if you're a recreational crabber out there in Chesapeake Bay this summer in Maryland waters, you got to throw the females back. There are also new regulations in Virginia that include an extended closure of a sanctuary in the lower portion of the bay and elimination of a winter dredge survey, a fishery that's existed for quite a long time, so a very bold management action on the part of Virginia. There's also increased size limits for peeler crabs and a gear reduction plan. My agency, NOAA, under the Department of Commerce, also declared a commercial fishery failure for the commercial blue crab fishery for the peeler and softshell crab industry based on a decline in landings for that portion of the fishery. Disaster assistance has been provided to both the states of Maryland and Virginia to the tune of $10 million to each state that will accomplish projects such as habitat restoration, fishery monitoring, industry diversification, and aquaculture to offset the lost income to watermen due to the disaster. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about oysters. First of all, regarding oyster abundance, based on our most recent data from 2007, there are approximately 2.73 billion grams. That's how we measure oysters as biomass, or that's about 9% of our goal for the oyster population. I want to talk a little bit about how we've been doing, though, to try to come back and bring the oyster population back in the Bay. The Chesapeake Bay program's goal is to implement restoration practices on 2,466 acres of oyster bar and reef habitat between 2007 and 2010. In other words, that's a shorter-term interim goal towards the long-term revival of oysters in the Bay. Last year, restoration efforts took place on about 943 acres. That brings the total acreage to 1,719, and that's about 70% of that 3-year goal from 2007 to 2010. The success of these habitat restoration techniques has been limited by numerous factors, including disease, poor water quality, fishing pressure, poaching, and habitat destruction in the Bay. So you can see it's tough to be an oyster and try to make a comeback with a lot of other contributing factors to your survival. I also want to mention, because it's a timely subject, that in 2008 there's been underway development of a programmatic environmental impact statement that evaluates alternatives for where we go in restoring oyster populations in Chesapeake Bay. The draft programmatic EIS was released by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers back in the fall, and Maryland completed the first year of a pilot study on how to best measure oyster biomass, which will improve our population assessment of oysters in the Bay and ultimately management of that species. Around the Bay, I think we were also seeing additional investment and interest in developing a more robust oyster aquaculture industry, relatively small at this point in Chesapeake Bay, but potentially a way to reduce harvest pressure on wild oysters and provide a viable economic means for the industry. Next, and I think this is a nice story to close with here in terms of fish passage, similar to the land preservation goals that were outlined earlier, and David Paler, I think, will talk about a little bit. Throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed, we have a variety of barriers to fish being able to move upstream into spawning areas that were historically available to them. And we've had some real success in removing some of those obstacles. In some cases, that has been the removal of dams. In other cases, that's been new lifts and fish ladders that allow fish to get around those barriers to their upstream migration. From 1988 through 2005, the Chesapeake Bay Program partners opened 1,838 miles of fish passage, and that actually surpassed the original goal that was set for 1,357 miles. And so, having achieved a goal, we set a new one, and in 2005, the Bay Program partners committed to increasing the restoration goal to 2,807 miles by the year 2014. And last year, 51 miles of fish passage were restored, and that brings the total up to 2,317 miles, and that's 83% of the new goal. And that's a 2% increase from 2007. So with respect to fish passage, we've made some real progress, exceeded a goal, established a new one, and are well on our way to meeting that. Next, I'm going to turn it over to David Paler from the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality.